Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Sinem. I'm the Vice President of Sydney University Law Society and I head the education portfolio. I'm joined by the two education event coordinators, Maddie and Ashvini.
Hello everyone, I'm Maddie. I'm in my fourth year and my previous degree was Arts and International Relations.
Hi everyone, I'm Ashvini. I'm in my second year of the JD.
Awesome. So welcome to the third and final panel of the annual Law School Basics series. This series has been generously sponsored by Allen & Overy and we would like to thank them for their continued support in getting these sessions to you.
Today in our panel, we have members from the law school. Firstly, we have Professor Barbara McDonald, who many of you may know from your study of torts, contracts, and equity. Next, we have Associate Lecturer Adam Wallman, who's currently pursuing a PhD in the area of commercial law. We are also joined by a fourth-year arts law LLB student, Carol Lynn.
First, I'd like to thank our panelists for graciously volunteering their time to be with us today and provide their insight into exam techniques, especially as we head into that mid-sem crunch time. We'll start off with a Q&A with the panelists with commonly asked questions that we've collated, and then if time permits, we'll open the floor and all participants here today, you can turn mute off and hopefully your camera on and ask a question, or alternatively, you can put it in the chat and we'll ask it for you. So my first question is for Barbara, and it is, what should I do to prepare for an open book exam compared to a closed book exam?
Well, I think you should prepare for an open book exam as if it were a closed book exam. I think the most important thing is really to get on top of the material before the exam. That doesn't mean to say you have to rote learn things. You have to understand what's going on and get the structure of your subject and the topics right, and get your summaries done. Now, the best summary is a summary you do yourself rather than somebody else's summary, because by doing the summary, you're getting it into your head, which is important. So for a closed book exam, I'd be preparing my summaries so that I can look over those and with the key points for each topic just before the exam. And for an open book exam, quite frankly, if there's a limited time, that's all you're going to have time to look at. I mean, I know you're doing online exams, which is, with longer periods. When we had 3-hour open book exams, students would spend hours and hours putting their notes in order, thinking they'd be able to look at them, but they wouldn't have time to look at them. But I suppose making the notes was the learning process. So that helped them. But really, that's it. Prepare for it as if it's for closed book.
Does anyone else have anything to say about that on the panel? Adam or Carol?
Really, just to follow up on what Barbara said, I just think the important thing to note is that an open book exam is not less work than a closed book exam. I think that's very much a preconception one can have going in, but whether you're online, whether you're in person, you just don't have time to flick through 50, 100 pages of notes during your exam. You really do need to be extremely, extremely familiar with the content, regardless of whether it's open or closed. So I think at the end of the day, the distinction is kind of much less significant than it can appear. Something I found really helpful when I was in law school is that I would do my summary notes, and it's just inevitable that your summary notes are going to be pretty massive. And so what I found immensely helpful, particularly for an open book exam, is to then make kind of a super summary of my own summary notes. And I do that in the form of scaffolds, which I gather Sinem said someone is going to talk to later on. So that's something that can be helpful if you can try and boil down really just the absolutely key at a very high level things from the whole topic into something that's no more than kind of 10 to 15 pages. That might be of use in an open book exam. Once you're getting larger than that, you just don't have much time to be flicking through notes.
Yep, definitely. I think that's a great idea, Adam. Thanks. So Carol, the next question is for you. Do you have any advice on turning lecture or tutorial notes into exam notes?
Yes,
yeah,
sure.
That's a good
that was
question.
Myself. That's awkward. I'm so sorry.
No, you're right. So actually, that's a really good question because I'm someone who used to write lecture notes and reading notes in separate documents. And as part of my summary, I would synthesize the two into one document and then synthesize that one document into scaffolds. I later learned that that was kind of a waste of time in one sense, because it was repeating a lot of work, and I ended up, instead of typing things out and synthesizing, I would just be lazy and copy and paste. And so now I found that the most effective way for me is I put all of my notes in one document, and at the end of each topic, I would actually just synthesize lecture notes and make sure that all the lecture notes correspond with the case readings that I've done and with the tutorial notes that we have, so that way, come exam time, you really only got one document to refer to. And that's how I think it's most effective to start creating scaffolds. In terms of the structuring of my lecture notes and my tutorial notes, I have my lecture notes in just dot point form, and then I have my case notes in a table. So in my table, I have the name of the case, and then I have two columns. On the left-hand side, I have a summary of I have the headings: principle, facts, issues, decision, and notes. And then on the right-hand column, I would write in this summary that I've identified from my readings. And then so when I get to exam time, I put the lecture notes and my readings notes into scaffolds, and the scaffolds, I also like them in table format. I just find it much clearer. So I'll have one, and that's the first step, two, the second step, and all of that in table format. And then at the end of my scaffold, I like to have a case summary, because that way it's easier to learn the cases. And when you have an open book exam and you know the facts of the case, and you just want something really specific, you can just Control F the document, which is the beauty of online exams. And so in my exam case notes summaries, I really only just have principles and key facts that would trigger a correlation if it was a problem question, for example, and I'm like, oh, that fact is similar to this case scenario. That's how I structure my lecture notes and turn them into exam notes. I also find it helpful to draw mind maps, because I'm quite a visual person. And so if you prefer to have things in a more visual layout, mind maps are also really helpful if you transfer your scaffolds into mind maps.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the table is a great idea. Thanks for that, Carol. Adam, did you have anything to add?
I actually think that was totally phenomenal. I don't really have tons more that I would want to say to that. The only thing I would just emphasize is I think something worth thinking about in notes is structure. The point of doing your summary notes is to see how everything fits together, because unfortunately, sometimes, even if you've done all the work, if you haven't taken that final step of going, how does this topic connect to this topic, connect to this topic, it won't your understanding won't necessarily translate into an exam. So I think the tips kind of Carol gave are extremely helpful in terms of that, and that's something to bear in mind. And then the other big thing in terms of wrapping your head around what is the structure of a topic, how do these ideas fit together, is just the unit of study outline will give you headings as a rule, and that's your kind of first starting point in going, how do each of the components of this topic fit with one another?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, another question for you, Adam, is how do you think students should prepare? Is there a difference in preparing for an online exam compared to an in-person exam?
Fundamentally, I don't think so. I really do think in substance they're the same. I think it's really just the kind of practical little on-the-day things. In terms of, obviously, you'll have your day planned out, probably your public transport planned out. How am I getting to uni? What are kind of the things I'm going to do before that exam? And those are going to be different when you're at home. And so obviously, there are the little things. If you're living with family members or in a share house, it's important to make sure that other people know you're sitting an exam. Don't bother me, don't knock on my door, don't play loud music, etc. But I think fundamentally, it really is the same thing at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think so too. I think probably like students who have just experienced online exams might be able to share a little bit more on this as well. But I find that having a monitor like another screen other than just your laptop really helps, because then you can, if you have like Apple Mac, you can kind of slide through different desktops. It's like, oh, the fifth desktop is why when like I had those like scaffolds, so let me quickly go there. And that's like your form of having tabs like you would in an in-person exam. So figuring out like the online system and the online world. Yeah, does anyone else have anything to say about that?
I might just jump in. Something that I definitely realized last year was that just because you have an online exam doesn't mean you can't have paper in front of you. I know it sounds very obvious, but I like to draw out the problem question in like, so I can see who's doing what or whatever. And I found it difficult when I got to like my first online exam in 2020. I was like, I need a piece of paper. I was like looking for a piece of paper. I was like trying to draw them. Like you need to just realize, I guess, that just because you're doing an online exam, you need to type. In substance, it's really the same, and you can use similar techniques to what you would anyway, but just transfer it. And I think one thing is also practice typing. A lot of the time in scaffolds, we're not typing in full sentence. Like you do have full sentences, obviously, but it doesn't necessarily flow how you might want a paragraph to, because you're like one, da, 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 and then you would like sub in the facts of whatever exam you have. But I think typing like actual paragraphs flowing is something that helps, because otherwise you have all this great work that you've done in a scaffold that's typed, and then you're not used to, like, normally we handwrite and you get in the flow of handwriting, but I think typing, because you've that delete button, makes it a lot harder to sit the online exam. That's my 2 cents.
Yes, I might jump in here too and say, as well as practicing typing, which I'm sure, I used to say practice your handwriting because everybody was typing, but and exams were handwritten, but now it's the other way around, and I can imagine it can be an issue for people who are not doing it all the time. I think also it's really handy to have some phrases that you use, that you get into, it is strongly arguable that, it is highly likely that, those sorts of things, so you don't have to think, how am I going to introduce this idea? You've just got some stock phrases that you can use. And one thing, I know this is in first semester and many of you have done torts now already, but if the JDs are listening and they're doing torts this semester in first year, I often say to people, don't waste time trying to be the judge on questions of fact. There is no point on that. The question has given you facts. And yes, it will be an issue, obviously, whether or not X was negligent, but we know you've got Section 5B in front of you, and it's a total waste of time to take the facts you've got and work through Section 5B. I've seen that so often with students. They spend paragraphs and pages working through Section 5B to decide whether someone was negligent, missing out legal issues like, what is the test of causation, or how do you deal with duty, or, how do you determine breach, or what do you do with a professional, peer professional opinion, or something like that. So remember, you should be spending your time on questions of law, usually, rather than questions of fact. Don't add facts. Work with the facts you've got, and if there's something uncertain, just say that. Just say you would need more, a court would need more facts to determine whether this was the case. So I think having your structure clear, your scaffold clear, whatever you like to call it, and I absolutely agree with Adam's point about at the end of your summary of a topic, think about where this fits in with other topics. So for example, if you're studying equity, you'll study constructive trust and you'll study resulting trusts. Once you've studied each one of them, one of the key things you want to do is, well, what's the difference? Or in torts and contracts too, you'll look at undue influence and unconscionable transactions. After you've studied both of them, what is the difference? When would you go to one instead of the other? It's that, as Adam pointed out, it's seeing where the topic fits in the whole course. And where that's directing you where you should go and spend your time.
Yeah, I think a really key part of organising that in an exam is reading time. So how would you suggest we use reading time in an online exam, especially where we're allowed to be writing?
Well, I always say to people, the first thing you should do when you're looking at a question is, first of all, look at the bottom line. What is the question asking you to do? Is it asking you to advise A or to advise B, or just discuss the issues that arise from these facts? So what is it asking you to do? And make sure you know that before you go back and then read the question. And then as you read the question, you want to use that time. I mean, I would be using it, I'd be printing it out with a pen and using that time to draw, as you say, draw little diagrams, Maddie. I mean, I think that's really helpful. Put jot points down as they occur to you. This is an issue here, this is an issue here, so that when you're then doing you're thinking also about the structure. How am I going to deal with this question? And perhaps having your framework, your structure and your headings, that's something you can work out in your note, as you're reading the questions. Look, you may have a choice, and choice is actually terrible because you've got to spend time making the choice. I always prefer not to give students choice so they don't waste their time making the choice. But when you've got a choice, you're really going to have to think about, well, what do I know best here? Has this got something in it that I'm really not confident about? Because if that's the case, you're better choosing something else. So, I mean, obviously, that is an issue. It depends on the format of the exam, of course. So, Adam, you might have some more ideas depending on, for example, for ICPL and so on.
I might jump in there. Yeah, I like to be quite prescriptive, and this was just an approach that I found works for me. So, if you disagree, don't use it. But I think there are really two things you need to do in reading time. The first is to read the question quite slowly and in detail. I know that when you're in an exam, you have a limited amount of time, especially in midterm exams where you have less time, you tend to get this rush of adrenaline that just makes you want to go really fast. But I think it's really important that the first time you read through that question, you just take a deep breath, read through it in detail, and try and pick up all of the key facts, because often some of those little facts that you might skim over if you're rushing too much will kind of be excellent fodder to make really good arguments that can then demonstrate that you have a great understanding and earn you marks. The second thing is, like Barbara said, I think it's just essential to plan your answer during reading time. I also think, as a rule, it's worth using slightly more than the time you're given for reading time to plan out your answer. As a ballpark, I like to think you want at least 20 minutes per kind of an hour-long question just to structure your answer. And if that means you have 5 to 10 minutes less of actual writing, it really won't matter at the end of the day, because what you write will be of higher quality. The other thing is, with problem questions, it's really important to know where you're going or where you think you're going to end up before you've even started. So I think you're much better off using that time to go, what is my plan? What are the key issues? Roughly how long do some of these key issues deserve in terms of how much time I'm going to spend on them before you actually start writing anything at all. And then the very last thing, kind of jumping back to that first step of reading the question in detail, is again what Barbara touched on and what we've touched on earlier about diagrams. I think in some subjects in particular, diagrams are really essential. I think in all of the property law related subjects, you should draw diagrams. They are so helpful. You'll have a lot of parties. It's really easy to lose track of who is who. Even in the midst of writing the exam, sometimes I find that I found that it was really easy to just put the wrong party name in at a particular time, and having that diagram there in front of you will help go, what are the key relationships? It'll immediately let you go, what are the kind of issues that I'm probably looking at here? And it'll hopefully stop you from making little mistakes like that as well. So as you read that question, jot down a diagram. You'll, if anyone kind of has me for either TC2 or IPCL, you'll see in some of TC2 and everything in IPCL, I never do a question without drawing a diagram. And that's because I think they're immensely useful. And so I would very much encourage you to do that in your exams, particularly in the subjects that I'm teaching. I think they're essential there.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Adam. So the next question is for you as well. So if I'm going over the word count of an online exam, what do you suggest I do? Should I just keep writing and then cut down after I'm done? Or would you suggest just being mindful of the word limit as we go?
I'm going to cop out here and say that the best thing that you can possibly do is to practice writing exam problems before you go into the exam. And when you do that, if you're doing it with a timer, you can figure out what process works best for you. I think kind of the number one tip that when I was at law school pushed me from a low credit student to a distinction and high distinction student was rewriting out every tutorial problem question in full, as if it was in an exam. And I found that really, really helped in terms of getting really familiar with the concepts, learning how to phrase arguments, as Barbara was talking about before. So I think if you take that opportunity, hopefully that will better place you to have an idea of how to phrase things more succinctly and stop you from getting into this problem in the first place. Otherwise, I'd be interested if people who have actually sat online exams have thoughts on this, because I kind of don't want to suggest that I'm an expert. You know, in my time in law school, I never had to sit an online exam. So I'm sure some people would have some kind of incredible insights here that I'm just not capable of sharing.
I guess I'm one of those people that have sat an online exam. I think your tips were really good, Adam, in terms of doing the practice beforehand. It makes a really big difference to, I guess, your approach to exams, and that also helps for us practice our typing ahead of the exam. But one tip that I have, which I actually used during an exam last year when I was running out of time, was I'm naturally quite a verbose person, so I decided that I would dot point the rest of my arguments. So a good tip that someone else gave me was to write down your heading, the issue, and the law. And so if I were running out of time, I think it would be helpful to have those dot points and make sure that you've actually outlined all of the issues that you've identified. And that way you know how much more of your analysis you have to go. And so I would recommend using the remainder of that time to go back and cut the first part of your answer, which you're finding is taking you over the word count. And hopefully after that, you've still got time to go back and actually add in your application of the law and just your conclusion to that heading and to the issue. But I think that's probably the most effective way of making sure that you cover all the bases. And if you do end up being so over the word count that you can't get in the analysis, at least the marker, well, in my opinion, at least I'm not a marker, but at least the marker knows that you've correctly identified all the issues.
Yeah, perfect.
I think going over the word limit is really dangerous, because there are different ways of dealing with that. It might just be a penalty, which could be very strictly applied, or it could be, as we do in some subjects, say we don't read it. So we cut off at 500 words and that's it. We don't read the rest. So if you've got key points in that excess words, you've lost them. So I think you have to really get used to writing concisely. And although I said, have some stock phrases, make sure they're not too long. P will argue or something like that. I mean, you can try and be concise. Go back over. I would say that I wouldn't keep writing and cut later. I don't think. I think I would stop and start cutting, start thinking, what have I said which really doesn't add anything particularly? I've already made that point. No point repeating it again. Headings really help, I think, be concise, because then everyone knows what you're talking about. If you've got, P versus D, or A versus B, you don't have to then introduce the fact that that's what you're dealing with. A versus B, this topic, A versus B, this issue. So, don't use too many, but certainly they do help cut down the words. Never worry about, for example, an introduction. I think, in an exam when you've got a tight word limit, go straight into the first issue. First issue to be discussed is this. And the same with the general conclusion. There's no point repeating what you've already said. That'll just add more words, unless it's a narrative essay, which is a different matter. But if it's a problem question, I would always say go straight into the first issue you want to talk about to keep the words down.
Yeah, definitely. This question, the one that you were interested in, Barbara, is for you. It's basically, if I'm running out of time, should I cover every issue briefly or a couple in more detail?
I would always say the first, cover every issue briefly, always, 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 because the danger is that some markers will actually allocate out of a thing out of 20 marks. So they'll sort of roughly have in their head that the student should have covered the following, and you won't get any marks, obviously, for that. If it's a question where there's A, B, C, and D, and you do A, B, and C really well, but don't get to D and E, I always say, with the best will in the world, an examiner cannot give a mark for a blank piece of paper, no matter how well you've done on something. A blank piece of paper can get no marks, or a blank section. So even if you just get a couple of words down, we can give a mark because we know you've identified what it's about. So I would always say, and I think that was a point, perhaps it was Maddie who made that point before, or Carol, set out your issues first, then go back and fill in what you're going to say about those issues. And that way the examiner knows that you have recognized the issues. Recognizing the issue is half the skill of doing a problem question.
I think I'll ask a question that's out of the order for a second, just in case I forget. But I have a question. I think an issue that I've come across is I get worried that I'm recognizing the issue, I'm going through the test, but what if I don't come to an answer that is like the probable answer? Like, you know how people say, yeah, Barbara, do you have it?
Yeah, sometimes we don't care what answer you come to, as long as you reason and use the materials that we've studied. We probably won't, we might give you a few things in an exam that are really obvious, legal answers, obviously, but there will always be some grey areas, because that's what we will have been talking about in tutorials. And so I wouldn't worry about that. I think the main issue is coming to your reasoning. Now, obviously, in some instances, and I think, Adam, ICPL and real property are these, you have to be able to work out whether it's an equitable interest or a legal interest, for example. And if you get in the wrong tack on an assignment question because you pick it as an equitable interest when it's a legal interest, you will go down the wrong rabbit hole, And so that sort of black and white issue is very important. But in a lot of subjects, there isn't a black and white issue. I mean, there'll be a substratum of black and white issues, but then you'll be getting into the grey areas where there is something to think about, something to persuade. And in many cases, we don't care what answer you come up with, as long as you show how you got there. To me, it's like a maths question. Show your reasoning of how you get to the final figure. And then, if you've added up 2 and 2 incorrectly on the way through, you've given all your other reasoning, which we know is right. And which we can see that you've understood what the materials are.
I really just want to repeat what Barbara said, but phrase it slightly differently. There are just no right or wrong answers in law, ever. There are better answers and there are worse answers. And the better answer in practice is the one that the judge is convinced by at the end of the day. And it's only the better answer until an appeal is successful. So it just doesn't matter what conclusion you come to if your reasoning is good. But like Barbara said, there are some cases where a particular answer will pretty unequivocally be the better answer. So IPCL is a good example in that there are some things which they're not quite black and white, but they're bordering on it. Usually there will be a pretty clear-cut answer to, is this, say, a legal interest or an equitable interest, depending on whether a certain formality has been made out. And often say that formality, it just absolutely cannot have been made out on the facts. But if you can find some grey in there, suddenly there's no right or wrong answer. And by the same token, I also don't want to suggest that kind of everything in property law is black or white by any means. So in IPCL in particular, there are some things where there do tend to be better and worse answers that are pretty clear, like that legal versus equitable interest in some cases. But then there are other issues which we look at, sometimes in the same tutorials, where there's almost never a better answer. And a really good example of that for people who are doing it is fixtures. It's just, you can always argue a fixture is going to go one way or the other way. And if you can produce good arguments, and preferably good arguments for both ways, what you ultimately conclude doesn't really matter. It's those arguments or that reasoning which will earn you the marks.
And I think just one of our last questions, second last question, before we open it up to the floor. Carol, this one's for you. how can I get into a mindset that is similar to when you're in an exam room, when you're at home, and it can be much easier to get distracted when you're at home than in an exam room. I think this is obviously a really personal question. Like everyone, I would be probably too stressed about the fact that I'm sitting an exam to go and look at something else that I wouldn't be doing anyway. But I suppose how do you kind of set up when you're sitting at home the fact that you're actually sitting an exam?
Yeah, I think it's a different kind of preparation, but I agree with Maddie in that you just have to go in with the same mindset. I think Adam mentioned before, just notifying your housemates and any family that you live with that you're doing an exam. If that means putting a sign on the door, do not disturb, just so that they don't come in and kind of disturb you. I like to set up probably 30 minutes to an hour before the allocated exam time, and that gives me time to set up the monitor and where my notes are going. One thing I recommend is just clearing your desk of anything that you don't need. That's really important so that you kind of don't feel like there's just a cluster of things around you. Setting a phone up or a timer as well so that you keep track of time. I like to put my phone on airplane mode so that I don't get messages and no one calls me. That's something I would recommend. And in terms of the actual lead up to the exam, so when I sat in-person exams, I kind of set up a routine, which involves having a coffee about an hour and a half before, then having a snack, and then I have this short 15-minute pre-exam playlist. And I think I started that in high school and during the HSC. So those in first year, I'm sure you have some sort of routine put together. So I would just recommend replicating that, but at home. And then the great thing about doing it at home is you can have a dance to yourself before the exam and shake it all out and no one is watching. So that's one thing that I would really recommend, is just having that pre-exam structure and knowing that you're doing the same thing regardless of whether you're at home or in person. And one thing I would add is that when I sat in person exams, I like to do a bit of a breathing exercise between when I sat down and when reading time started. So that's something that you can easily replicate at home as well. Just take a few deep breaths and just know that you've got this and you can do the exam. If you do need to go to the bathroom as well, just kind of keep in mind timing, and of course the same restrictions don't apply to having someone follow you into the bathroom, not literally, but to supervise you. So also just going to the bathroom is another thing that you sometimes forget that you can do during an online exam. And one thing I would add about setting up technology and making it all work is it is really scary starting an online exam. You don't know what could happen. I've heard stories about Canvas dropping out and people not being able to access their exam. I personally have made one of the biggest mistakes ever in an exam last year, where I set up what Sanem described before as having desktop after desktop of notes, and I accidentally swiped on the exam, it's the Canvas exam page itself, and I closed the exam. And the level of panic I had about not being able to get back into it was enormous. So one thing I would recommend is the actual page that you're doing your exam on, don't swipe away from that. Have another screen. If it's an iPad, if it's your notes printed out, if it's a monitor, stick to that screen and don't swipe across, especially if you're on a MacBook. It's so easy to lose track of which page you're at. And also, speaking to that, another tip that I have is in terms of sitting online exams. I've forgotten, but it was a really good tip. So come back to me on that, because it's another mistake that I made, which I later learned. So yes.
I'll jump in and tell you about a mistake I did. I lost my so evidence law is a 3-day exam for the final, 70%. And at 3:00 in the morning on the last day, it was due at 10 a.m. I lost my entire paper. So my computer had been auto-saving to nowhere. So I'd been Command S'ing the entire time, and I just had to redo it and hand it in at 10. Luckily, I had rewritten it so many times to try get like phrasing well that I could just start handwriting it while my computer was like freaking out. But check your saving that it is going to somewhere. Like if you've set it up to OneDrive or whatever, make sure your OneDrive is not corrupt, or make sure that wherever Word is auto-saving to is in fact auto-saving, and not just telling you it is and then saving it to no location. Because I'll just put it really frankly, the uni doesn't care if it was a error that you could have foreseen by checking your saving. I'm sure tutors and lecturers, they all care, especially if they know you or they know your face. But the reality is with online exams, you need to take extra steps that you wouldn't take if you were handwriting something. You would take 10 pens or something, but so that if a pen runs out, you just pick up another one. But online, if you lose your paper, you've lost the paper. Or if you close the site, you've closed the site, and that's something that you should have foreseen as a possibility, and therefore, had some fallback options. So don't do what I did, and please make sure your documents are actually saving.
As of this year, I've just transferred everything to Google Drive. I now do not use my laptop to save anything.
I do not trust iCloud at all.
Yeah, it's like this resolution. I have folders, and each of those folders have emojis. Like for insolvency law, I have an emoji of showing a graph going down to like show that the business is going down. So like these are things that the internet can provide you that, your normal laptop won't. But yeah, does anyone else have anything to say about getting into the mindset?
One thing, a good tip, sorry to jump in guys, is every time, if it's like a 48-hour or longer assignment, every time I write an updated version, I just email it to myself, like a draft.
Yeah.
So there's no way you can lose that unless you forget your password or something. So it's like a 99%
resolve a password. Yeah.
Yeah, 99.9% protection if you just email it to yourself. So
I think that's Can I say that's an excellent idea? But the other thing I was wondering when you're talking about saving it to OneDrive or Google Drive, and I think it's a great idea to email it to yourself, but what about actually working on your computer itself as a Word document, so that then if the internet drops out and you suddenly can't get back into it or something, you can still keep working on that document? I'm not really sure. So many different
that's what, well, this is just my circumstance in that one exam, but that's what I was doing. And the actual document, it said the last time it had saved was actually 10 p.m. And so I lost from 10 p.m. till 3 a.m. Okay, given I perhaps should not have been working, maybe that was a sign from the universe not to work from 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. But had I done the emailing thing every couple of hours, I wouldn't have lost 5 hours. I maybe would have just lost 1 hour of work. But
the internet services are like a little bit more reliable than your actual computer itself, because the computer can crash and you can't access like something. You can always have hotspot if your Wi-Fi doesn't work, like to go onto your 4G.
Yes.
Or
location
or something.
Yeah, so with OneDrive, that's automatically on Word. I highly recommend OneDrive. I found it probably the most reliable so far. And the beauty with OneDrive is you can actually set up your exam documents beforehand. So the day before an exam, I will go in and I will program it to Times New Roman, 12-point font, 1.5 or 2 spacing, whatever the exam requirements are, save it, and then you can go back in and check that, oh, it's already actually started saving. That's one way to prevent the crash. And
the advantage of something like that, I do a similar thing, but I use Google Drive to back up my PhD or my research, is that you can have both. So ideally you've got something that is saved to your computer that is being automatically backed up every couple of minutes to your cloud. And that way, if your internet drops out, you've still got it. Whereas if your computer dies, hopefully there's something else available.
One question I have for everyone, and it's probably relevant to all of our listeners today as well, but if it's an exam in Canvas, if it's a short answer exam, do you think it's better to write all the answers out in Word and then copy and paste it in, or write it straight into Canvas?
I can't answer the technicalities like that. Adam, what do you think?
I hate writing straight into Canvas. I don't even answer discussion board questions on Canvas. I write them in Word. I copy paste them into Canvas. I copy paste them into Canvas, and then to the extent that they need to be reformatted, I do that. I think it's much better. It also means that you're guaranteed, in the same way we're just talking about exams, that your work is being backed up in your Word document. And usually, just bear in mind you need a couple minutes to copy paste it and to reformat it, and usually you'll lose all your paragraphs. So
yes, and just check that you don't lose anything. I copied something from Word recently into Canvas, so feedback, and it jumbled up all the figures that I'd put in. It copied 27 out of 30 into 70 out of 30, which made no sense. So I don't know how that happened. It did it again. So if you do copy from Word into Canvas, you will need to leave yourself time to read over it and check, proofread it again. And that brings me to another point, Maddie. You were working from 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. The point of these exams, one of the reasons, I don't know, I know all the different subjects are different. Some give you 3 hours, some give you 48 or whatever. But, if it is longer than 3 hours, the point is that it's a substitution for a 3-hour exam. It's not a 48-hour exam. You're not expected to be taking 48 hours to do it, but the 48 hours is because we know that students have all sorts of other commitments, so it just is a way of dealing with that. It's also a way of dealing with time zones when we have international students, so that everybody has time to do the exam in daylight hours rather than in the middle of the night. So perhaps this goes back to setting yourself up. I would tend to set yourself up for the exam. I mean, I'm sure I would take at least 6 hours to do the 3-hour exam, I'm sure, when you've got the time. But that's what you should aim for, I think. This is a 3-hour exam, but I'm setting aside today from 9 till 5 to do it. And that's what you should be telling your family and your flatmate and telling yourself, and get it over with. And then think back and then come back to it the next day, and you might think of something overnight and just tweak it. But it shouldn't take you 48 hours, or you'll be jet lagged at the end of it, and then you'll be hopeless for the next one.
I now set fake due dates if it's a longer exam, because I tend to just spend far too long on something I know. Like, I know the content, but I try to say it the best way, and it's like, just write it, and then it's probably no different from the best way. Like, if you're saying like substantively the same thing, it really doesn't actually matter how good you think it sounds. But that is a tip that I never had thought of until a grad who did something for the Sales Women's, so name, do you remember Maddie Smith? Yeah, she had said, I set fake due dates, and I was like, wow, I should do that. So that's really helped. If anyone listening hasn't realized that's an option, it definitely is.
It's a bit of a mental game though, so you have to really have self-discipline to actually convince yourself that there's a fake due date. So it's
I know.
Something to try and bear in mind is just that your first draft of anything is never going to be half as good as you want it to be. Just first drafts are bad, that's how it is. But when you have 3 hours in an exam, you only have a chance to do that first draft, so you just do it. So I think that fake due date thing is a really good way of just getting it out there. I find, as a rule, writing now, even out of an exam context, I think fundamentally it's the same thing when I'm drafting for my PhD or when I'm working on papers. I find that the first draft that I just kind of like pump out in a short period of time, as opposed to a really tortured first draft, which I try and make good, they tend to be equally bad. It's just to the extent that you can get something down on paper, do it, and then you can come back and edit it later. And kind of, also do bear in mind, even though we're giving you 48 hours, we expect that this exam, in TC2 last semester, it was 48 hours, but it would have taken 3 hours to do. I can't see how one would have made their paper any better once they spent more than 4 or 5 hours. I can see how it would have been very possible to kind of torture yourself into going, how can I make it better? But I think there's just a kind of negligible returns at the end of the day. And so we expect it to be a first draft when you have an exam. To some extent, that is kind of the nature of it. It's okay.
Sorry, Adam, I accidentally cut you out there. One point Barbara made earlier about the timing, I just wanted to jump on and say, so although it's not a hard and fast rule, but a lot of the time law exams I will be more so in the morning, from what I've noticed, or latest like 11, 12. So I think a good way to prepare yourself for exams is to condition yourself to be studying at those times. So by the time you're sitting in an exam situation, it feels no different, so that your body is routinely wired to be working productively at that time. So if you can try and make a part of your routine to productively be studying at like 9 a.m. or earlier hours of the morning, that might help. So by the time you're in an exam situation, it doesn't feel too much different in terms of mindset.
Yeah.
But that's obviously catering for like work and other commitments. But if you can try and like wire your body in that way, that might help in preparing for exams.
Yeah.
I think that's really good advice, but I also think it's also bear in mind that you should do what's best for you. So if it does happen that you work your best between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m., which is not usually the case, but you know, if that's the case and you have the luxury of doing that because you have your exam timetable in advance, then kind of do what works best for you. But I think as long as you plan it out. Personally, I work best from kind of 8 to 11. And so when I have time pressure things, I try and schedule them then. But
yeah. Well, I'm noting the time, so I think we'll open the floor to any audience questions. Does anyone have anything to ask? Yep, Hannah Lee James has raised her hand. Feel free to take the floor.
Yeah, that's my full name. Sorry. Thank you, first of all, to the organizers and to the panelists for spending the time talking about this today. But I just had a question about referencing in an online exam format. So some of our exams are timed, some of them aren't, and obviously that's kind of explanatory with how much detail you go into with referencing. But if you had like a timed exam, say 3 hours or something more limited, how specific are the references expected to be in an online exam? Are they pinpointed, or are they more similar to an in-person exam format?
I think this is something that you should definitely raise with your convener and lecturer on the discussion board or in class. But on the discussion board is a good place because then everybody sees the answer. So you find out what the expectations are in that particular subject. If it were a 3-hour exam, I would say, to me, it's like just a substitute for a sit-down exam, and we wouldn't be expecting references. We wouldn't be expecting citations. If the case is on the reading list, everyone knows what the citation is. I'd just be giving the name of the case and underline the name of the case so it stands out, or italicize it, obviously, if it's as you're typing. But that's really, this is not a research assignment. You are expected to answer the exam from the materials in the reading guide. And we all know what's in the reading guide, so it's a matter of identifying the relevant case or the relevant article or whatever that you've used, or the book. So that's what I'd say there. But if it's longer than 3 hours, then you do need to it should be absolutely clear, the convener, the lecturer, whoever it is in charge of the subject for everybody should make that clear, either in the exam instructions or prior to that on the discussion board.
Usually the exam instructions are released in advance, so please read them and hopefully read them 8 times over, and just follow them. In TC2 last semester, it was 48 hours, but we did not require footnotes. And so to the extent that some people did use footnotes and have pinpoint references, it eats into your word count. And it's not bad, it's not held against you. But if you're using a lot of words to write out the full names of cases, including citations and pinpoint references, and someone else is using those words to make arguments that advance, the various points of view that they're expressing, the latter person is likely to have more in there that's able to earn better marks. So just read the exam instructions.
Yep. Do you guys have any other questions from the audience? I'll wait a little bit. Yep.
One?
Yep.
Sorry, I can't do my video, internet issues. But I wanted to ask, and this is I'm JD1, so probably quite a basic question, but in the current assignments we have, we've got the elements that are set out for each, for the torts, for instance, for each tort. And then we've got what we can consider a central issue in each case we're given. And I'm wondering how to lay out the exam answer. Do we lay it out as, let's say, battery, the issues as the elements? Is it an intentional act? Is it directly applied, and so forth? Or do we highlight what we consider is a central issue that might be a little bit more unique, drawn from those elements, but a little bit more unique? So how do we structure that answer?
Yes, a problem question is most unlikely to be asking you to set out everything you know about a particular tort. It's probably honing in on one element of the tort. For example, in assault, the issue will be whether or not, maybe whether or not the threat is an imminent threat rather than a threat of something sometime in the future. It may be an issue of whether it's direct or something, false imprisonment. Was the person actually imprisoned? Was it false? And so on. So certainly hone in on the issue. You should have a workable definition of each tort, which is very concise and which includes all the elements. But your summary should have all the elements and all the issues that come up, but you certainly won't. You should not need to set out all of those in answering the particular question. It will be asking you about something in particular. So hone in on those issues. The critical issue here. You might be able to say something like, well, it's obvious that this was a threat of violence. The issue will be whether or not it was sufficiently imminent or something like that, or whether or not X has a defence of self-defence. That will be the main issue, rather than whether or not an assault occurred. Does that answer your question?
Sort of does, Barbara, but I don't know why I got the distinct feeling that in this initial causes like 5001, Laws 5001, our ability to know all the elements is being exercised or is being examined. So for instance, if I'm given a case and I haven't gone through the facts and shown that direct force was applied, let's say it's battery, that it was intentional, and kind of ruled all that and used the authorities to show where that is, I kind of feel that they'll mark me down unless you advise.
No, you should obviously, you should set out the elements on the facts, but this is the sort of thing you should have done in tutorials, and you've got that how to answer a problem question, which gives you some examples. But in your tutorials, for example, you'll have a fairly complicated fact situation with a whole lot of different parties. You've got to sort of show that you recognise all the issues in the question. So don't spend too long on just part of the question. By all means, as I say, if you have a good workable definition of what is a battery, that will include all the elements, and you might be able to say very clearly that the elements are clearly satisfied on the facts, except for one in particular, or something like that. So it depends on the facts that you're given as to what you should spend your time on.
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. I'm going to share my screen just to show you guys an example of a scaffold that was provided by a student whose name is Sophia Mendez. She's one of our exec members, the campus director. And can everyone see that? Maybe someone, yeah, cool. So this is like an example of her scaffold, and you can all figure out what works best for you. But this is something that would help in an exam to really quickly look over. Everything's in a sort of dot point way, and it goes like a waterfall basically. And what she has said, I asked her to send like a message to me, and I'm going to read it as if I am her. So this is Sophia's voice. So number one, I like to keep formatting basic, otherwise I fret over and I waste time rather than learning the content. Other people really enjoy making theirs nice, but for me it stresses me out. So I think she's referring to people like me who color code the crap out of their notes. Number two, make sure you have an authority for everything, especially with open book exams. Make sure that in your notes the citations are correct and in the right format so that you can throw it into the problem question when you write it. Number three, ensure you outline the test. So scaffolds are just what the law itself is, but in the problem question, make sure you are focusing on the facts. The way I outline my scaffold is in questions, so it forces me to look at the facts and assess, for example, whether a statement is sufficiently promissory. Number four, don't forget about the cases themselves. I think a trap you can easily fall into with scaffolds that just outline the rules and seemingly ignore the reasoning of judges and facts of the cases is that you might fail to analogize facts from the problem question to cases you have studied. Often when writing problem questions, you will find that aspects will mirror the facts of the cases you have studied. So make sure you let the marker know that you actually read those cases, for example, by saying, like in Dick Bentley Production and Harold Smith, the statement is sufficiently promissory. So note how I have cases for situations where the statement is sufficiently promissory and cases where the court found it wasn't, so that you can make those links in the exam. And yeah, so basically that's an example of how one person's scaffold can look, and I hope that provides some of you some clarity. Stop sharing.
Yes, I'd jump in there too, as you say, that it is important that when you're reading cases that you don't just extract the principle of law and that you are familiar with the facts, because that is going to help you when you read something. Oh, this is like that, or it's slightly different from that. So therefore we can distinguish that case. It's got everything that that case had, but it doesn't have this. So it is really important. So perhaps in your summaries or somewhere, you need to just have a bit of a trigger for yourself about what was that case about. Yeah. I mean, frankly, I find that easier in subjects like torts and equity because the facts vary so much more than in contracts. But nevertheless, you need something to trigger what was that case about in terms of the facts. That would help you, I think. Yeah,
I'm pretty sure mine for torts, for that, the bottle with the snail inside it, was, what was the Donahue and Stevenson?
Oh, thank goodness you know the name. That's such a relief. Yes.
It came to me because I said snail bottle, and that was like my trigger word for the case. Yeah. Snail bottle, and that's all I had.
Yes, and look, if you do get stuck, there's nothing wrong with saying the case about the whatever. If you can't remember what it was, at least again the examiner knows that you know there's a case there. You just you've got a mind block about what the name was, but that's better than nothing. Yeah.
Also keep in mind that you might incorporate facts or questions into your scaffolds. If you'd indulge me sharing my own screen, these are the slides I used in TC2 last semester, and I'm going to use TC2 because I don't think anyone's taking it now. You'll see in this kind of mini scaffold I have here, I've got little examples with a really, really brief description of what happened in the facts of those cases. Yeah. And for me, I find that when I can boil down not what's the principle, but like what actually happened in the case into a really short sentence, that helps me remember the fundamentals. And then you'll find when you start writing, all of these extra facts that aren't in that really concise summary start popping into your head, because ideally you've listened to the lectures, you've read the cases in full, and this extra detail will just kind of come back to you. But I think that's something worth thinking about. Can I also, sorry, just one quick thought on the question that was asked before. I just wanted to emphasize in problem questions, you do need to address every issue, but you should spend more time talking about the issues that are contested. So if, for example, causation is really, really, really obvious, you still need to address it, but you will want to do it very quickly. And if remoteness is where kind of what you think the big issue is there, then that should take up the bulk of your words. So you do need to address everything, but spend more time on what's important and less time. And sometimes that can mean very, very little time on what you think is very uncontroversial.
Yeah. Any other questions from the audience? I think everyone is done. They're checked out. They're emotionally, mentally checked out. All right. Okay, so I think that's it from us. Thank you so much to the panelists. You've really gone above and beyond with your answers, and I really hope that everyone here has enjoyed it and has taken something from it. Yeah, thank you.
Good. Okay, good luck, everyone.
All the best.
Yeah. Okay.
Everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.